Oh, good morning. This is going to be the fifth tape, and I think the last one for the third testing period. We're going to talk about the waning, the end of the progressive movement in the 1920s, particularly in Texas. During the second era of Fergusonism, the first era of Fergusonism was the election of Jim Ferguson in 1914 until he was impeached in 1917. But the second era of Fergusonism began when Miriam Ferguson ran and defeated Felix Davidson, the Klan-endorsed candidate for governor, in 1924. So 1925 and 1926, Miriam Ferguson would serve as governor of the state of Texas. And it can be said definitively that reform took a holiday when the Fergusons held office. No new novel concepts of government were advocated by Miriam Ferguson, and no drastic proposals were proposed during her 2 years in office. But problems soon occurred relative to the governor's very liberal pardoning policy. Miriam Amanda Ferguson issued 2,000 acts of clemency in just 20 months while in office. And that invoked lots of gossip about inside deals that Governor Ferguson was making on behalf of her husband Jim Ferguson. Most pardons came on the recommendation of Jim Ferguson, the husband and former governor of Texas of Miriam Ferguson. Some pardons and paroles occurred even before the beneficiaries of that pardon and parole had even been arrested and spent even one day in prison. And that was an extraordinary situation. Too often, as was the case in a LaGrange, Texas case involving the Langerhans family, a pardon was followed up after several weeks or months later with the transfer of monies or often properties to Governor Jim Ferguson. So Miriam Ferguson, as governor, would grant pardons and paroles quite liberally, 2,000 acts of clemency in just 20 months. And in the case of the Langerhans, the young Mr. Langerhans was convicted. Was not convicted, he was actually arrested and charged with raping a young woman in LaGrange, Texas. But before the Langerhans could even be arrested by the local authorities, his family appealed to Miriam Ferguson, and Mrs. Ferguson gave young Mr. Langerhans a pardon that absolved him of the crime, and several months later the Langerhans family very quietly donated and transferred title to several hundred acres of land to who but the governor's husband, Jim Ferguson, former governor of Texas. The paroles scandals within the pardons and paroles process cast considerable doubt on the integrity of Mr. and Mrs. Ferguson. But the primary criticism in 1925 and 1926 came over work that was done by the Highway Commission, because Mrs. Ferguson wound up being the governor in 1925. The state legislature, after the Limestone County Texas Supreme Court case, the legislature had rewritten the bylaws of the Texas Highway Department, and a new commission had been created, and whoever was governor in 1925 was going to get to appoint all three members of the newly constructed Texas Highway Commission. And as irony would have it, someone less than scrupled, i.e. Miriam Amanda Ferguson, became governor of Texas. And she very promptly appointed three individuals who had been friends of her husband for years to serve on the Highway Commission. The favoritism and kickbacks occurred in the letting of road contracts, And when I say favoritism and kickbacks, I mean multi tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars were paid in kickbacks to the Ferguson appointees or to Jim Ferguson himself while his friends served on the Texas Highway Commission. For instance, in the case of the American Road Company that was capitalized in Dallas, Texas by Frank Lanham, Frank Lanham was the uncle, the great uncle of one of our professors at Schreiner University when I first came here, Samuel Willis Tucker Lanham III. Governor Lanham, the first Samuel Willis Tucker Lanham had been governor, and one of the Lanham family, Frank, was a alleged black sheep of the family, and Frank Lanham fell in and cast his lot with the Fergusons and was appointed to the Highway Commission. The American Road Company was Frank Lanham's road company, and it was capitalized with a total capitalization of $5,000, not 50, excuse me, $5,000 total capitalization for the American Road Company. And contracts, many contracts were let to the American Road Company calling for 2 course applications of asphalt, and the company would then routinely lay 1 course of asphalt while billing the state of Texas for 2, thus committing fraud and racking up massive profits. The American Road Company capitalized for only $5,000, did hundreds of thousands of dollars of highway business, allegedly, in the state of Texas. It would take Texas Attorney General Daniel Moody, to prosecute these companies, canceling a number of suits and projecting himself as the chief opponent of Miriam Ferguson in the period 1925-1926. Mrs. Ferguson survived her 2 years of office only because once the pardon and paroles issue in the prisons and the road scandals were brought to light by late 1925, the Texas legislature had already met earlier in the year and had adjourned from its biennial session. The legislature would not meet in regular session again until January 1927. Criticism of Mrs. Ferguson grew great, and there were those who said the legislature needs to convene and to impeach and remove Miriam Ferguson as governor of Texas. Again, the calls, however, for Mrs. Ferguson's impeachment and potential removal as governor, came after the legislature had adjourned from its regular session and was no longer in session. The legislature could not call itself then, nor can it call itself into special session today. The only person that can call a special session of the legislature is the governor, and the governor stipulates the reasons why he or she wishes to have a called session of the legislature. And Mrs. Ferguson, as governor, was highly unlikely to call a special session for the express purpose of impeaching Miriam Ferguson as governor of the state of Texas. While legislative leaders stewed and tried to figure out how to get Mrs. Ferguson to call a special session of the legislature, they finally came up with a novel idea. And legislative leaders appealed to Governor Ferguson to call a special session of the Texas legislature because, allegedly, there was a massive outbreak of hoof and mouth disease in Texas cattle. And so the legislative leaders asked Mrs. Ferguson to call a special session of the Texas legislature for the express purpose of dealing with the hoof and mouth disease in the cattle industry in Texas. But the truth is that Miriam Ferguson rejected the request by the state legislative leadership, and in her statement of rejection, she made it perfectly clear in whose mouth the legislature wished to stick a hoof. i.e., it was going to be in her mouth. And so the governor said, "No, I'm not going to call a special session for hoof and mouth or any other rationale. No special session." Even if Governor Ferguson had called a special session of the legislature to deal with the hoof and mouth disease in cattle, it would not have been legally possible for the legislature, once in special session, to say, "Well, now that we're here to deal with this problem with cattle, why don't we just simply impeach Mrs. Ferguson for crimes against the state of Texas?" That would have been outside the scope of the special call of the special session. And governors not only call special sessions, but they stipulate the subjects to be addressed during that special session. So it was that Mrs. Ferguson never faced a potential of being impeached after about August of 1925. But in May of 1926, Mrs. Ferguson lost to her Democratic challenger, Attorney General Dan Moody, in the Democratic primaries, despite the best efforts of her husband to retain Miriam Ferguson as governor of Texas. It's noteworthy to acknowledge that Mrs. Ferguson lost the South Texas vote in 1926, losing over 90% of the vote, after winning 90% of the South Texas vote in 1924, which again shows how very much so the highly manipulated South Texas vote was, and how easy it was to purchase the vote in South Texas, as corrupt as South Texas politicians were, such as Manuel Guerra and others. Moody, as governor in 1927 and 1928, had a solid reform reputation. He had prosecuted Ku Klux Klan members in Williamson County, that's Georgetown, north of Austin, a distinction that earned for him the Attorney General's position in 1925. As governor, Dan Moody advocated new taxation to offset the growing cost of government. He advocated increasing the number of justices on the Texas State Supreme Court, and he consistently advocated for a civil service law for the state to do away with political favoritism, to make Fergusonism and having rival politicians sweep into the governorship and fire virtually every state bureaucrat that had a job and replace every single state bureaucrat. Moody was a strong advocate for civil service reform. But the state took little action other than to manage the prison system through the creation of a commission. That's a prison commission, the forerunner of the Texas Department of Corrections of today, the TDC. The legislature created this prison commission and hired Sherman businessman Lee Simmons as a prison manager in 1930. And after Lee Simmons' attempt to run professionally the prison system, prison operations improved dramatically in the state of Texas, with costs of the prison system being lowered after 1930. In 1928, Dan Moody was opposed in the Democratic gubernatorial primary, but defeated Lewis Wardlaw, W-A-R-D-L-A-W. Lewis Wardlaw was the hand-picked opponent of Dan Moody, hand-picked by Jim and Miriam Ferguson. So despite the fact that the Fergusons didn't run, they chose the opponent of Dan Moody, but Moody defeated Wardlaw handily in the primaries in 1928. In the November 1928 general election, that was a presidential election year in Texas, and the Democrat governor of New York, Alfred Al Smith, split the Texas Democratic Party because Smith was a Catholic and he was a wet in the question of prohibition or not. He supported drinking, and his support of the wets in Texas offended many teetotaling Baptist and Methodist Protestants. At the Texas Democratic State Convention in 1928, Harmony Democrats, as they were called, Harmony Democrats, led by Governor Moody, prevailed over the anti-Smith Constitutional Democrats. And Smith was nominated at the Houston, Texas 1928 Democratic National Convention. Texas Democrats bolted with the Texas Republicans, many Texas Democrats bolted and supported Herbert Hoover, who won the state of Texas in 1928. Largely, they supported Hoover because Southern Democrat and Protestants held Smith's Yankee New York roots and his Catholicism against him. But in the same election, United States Senator Tom Conley defeated Earl Mayfield for the United States Senate seat, and that was good because Earl Mayfield was a Klan-backed, Klan-endorsed, Klan-elected United States Senator. So Tom Conley defeated Earl Mayfield in the 1928 Texas senatorial election. Moody's second term in 1929 and 1930 was generally prosperous, but in his last year in office, Texas began to feel the economic stress of the national panic, which swept the stock market and caused massive bank failures beginning in 1929, i.e. the coming of the Great Depression. The Texas expansion, economic expansion in the 1920s in terms of transportation and urbanization and growth in the petroleum industry visibly slowed as Texas fell prey to the coming of the Depression. Certainly in the 1920s, one can say that the automobile had revolutionized Texas. By 1929, there was one Texas automobile for every 4.3 Texas citizens. And so the automobile was embraced dramatically by Texas. But why shouldn't the automobile have been embraced by Texas? Given the size of the state, travel was almost prohibitive unless one was automated and used an automobile. And so Texans obviously were going to embrace the automobile perhaps more so than any other citizens of any other state of the Union. Yet a more mobile society meant enhanced urban growth and a decline in rural life. While rural Texas grew 9%, rural Texas grew at a rate of 9% increase from 1920 to 1929. At the same time, urban Texas grew 58%, while the overall percentage of the state's rural population declined from 48% in 1920 to just 40% by 1930. Railroad development, deep water ports, transportation ports had spurred the growth of urban areas. For instance, the Houston Ship Channel was built in the 1920s. The Houston Ship Channel was 55 miles long. It was 30 feet deep and 75 to 100 feet wide. It was a big ditch. And the Houston Ship Channel transformed Houston, which was inland, not on the coast, into a major international port. At the same time, the additional discoveries in petroleum were adding to the urbanization of Southeast and North Texas. Yet while industry boomed, labor unions in the 1920s declined, to the point that they were more prominent in 1900 than labor unions would be by 1930, due primarily to the closed and open shop issue in Texas, i.e. whether workers who went to work at a company that had a labor union in it had to, by law, become a member of the labor union. That's a closed shop. We have an open shop concept in Texas. And if one goes to work in a company that is unionized, you don't have to join the union. But if the union negotiates benefits, those benefits are increased from the company by all company employees, even those who are not members of the labor union. So the open close shop controversy hurt labor unions, and poor union management certainly had had a reason for the decline in labor unions. Let's take a look at life in the Roaring Twenties before the coming of the Great Depression. The image of the Roaring Twenties has flapper girls, raccoon coats, speakeasies, people dancing the Charleston, but that was highly exaggerated for conservative Texas. There were important cultural and religious changes evident in the lifestyle of Texans. Some were good and some weren't so good. Societal behaviors changed with concern over immodest dress, dancing, smoking, drinking, the movies, automobile riding, an increased crime rate, and increased narcotic use in the 1920s. The movies and the automobile were often singled out for condemnation by conservative preachers such as Billy Sunday, who referred to automobiles as rolling houses of prostitution, where teenagers particularly would go out parking and succumb to the temptations of sexuality. So lots of conservative preachers had bad things to say about the transportation automobile revolution. Efforts to regulate morality took several forms, including the Klan that would whip and tar and feather folks who had been unfaithful to the institution of marriage in public events, etc. Some Texas cities created movie boards to censor unacceptable scenes from movies. Some cities prohibited movies being shown on Sundays. Laws regulated bathing attire and stipulated exactly, how much skin could be shown by women particularly, and laws that regulated unacceptable behavior were passed by many Texas cities. For instance, there were laws that said that women could not publicly smoke, couldn't smoke in public because that was a sign of a fallen woman, a woman who was a prostitute. Changing morality was reflected in the status of the Texas family. The Texas divorce rate more than doubled from 1915 to 1929. And in 1929, the divorce rate in Texas was one of the nation's highest. At the same time, family sizes fell from an average of 4.6 members of the family in 1920 to only 3.5 in 1930. Certainly by 1930, the effects of the Depression were being felt, and couples were saying, wow, maybe we better not have that second child. So that's why the numbers fell under 4 to 3.5 on average. Many women improved their economic condition in the 1920s, increasing the number of married women working outside the home. And by 1929, 3 women even served in the legislature. And remember that Miriam Ferguson, despite the fact that she was not a very effective and ethical governor of Texas, was only the second elected governor in the nation to have been popularly elected. The first was Wyoming's Nellie Ross, whose husband was governor of Wyoming, and he died in office, and the voters elected his widow as Wyoming's governor. The gender equity issues, especially salary and property management, still remained for many Texas women. Among blacks, there occurred in the 1920s a migration from rural to urban Texas, and more blacks left Texas for the American North than moved into the state. The period of the 1920s was referred to as the Great Migration for Southern blacks, because it was in the 1920s that many Southern blacks said, we will never face equity in race in the South, so I think I'm going to move north into the northern states. And that migration was so great that it is referred to as capitalized G and capitalized M, the Great Migration of the 1920s. Education in 1929 in Texas showed marked but slow progress. Though lagging behind national norms, Texas utilized constitutional reforms, local responsibility, expanded teaching resources, and rural consolidation to address the economic needs of Texans. Ironically, it was Jim Ferguson's administration that witnessed passage of a state compulsory school law in 1916, and in 1918, the state of Texas, by constitutional amendment, provided free textbooks to the children in public schools. The overall state tax rate was increased. In 1920, limits on the tax rate that communities levied for educational purposes were abolished, which allowed a much higher rate of taxation and improvements in the educational program in the state of Texas. Rural school consolidation began by law in 1914, and by 1930, there were 1,530 Texas school consolidations that had been made. The one-room Little Red Schoolhouse was no more in the state of Texas. In the 1920s, the schools changed their curriculum to teach more life skills, Voc Tech it was called, in health programs, etc. But controversy ensued whether or not to teach evolution, as we acknowledged. And Mrs. Ferguson, and just as the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee, fundamentalists didn't want anything but the creation story being taught in the public schools. Texas blacks faced discrimination and economic opportunity. For instance, East Texas, where blacks constituted 33% of the school-age children, 97% of the high schools in East Texas were white for whites only. The junior college movement expanded also in the 1920s. The junior college movement began in 1897 when the Baptist Convention established a working relationship between Baylor and Mary Hardin Baylor as four-year senior institutions and Howard Payne, Rusk, and Decatur Baptist as two-year junior college institutions. By 1920, church-related junior colleges were established, and the state at the same time created 12 junior colleges located in Stephenville and Arlington. Two junior colleges located in Stephenville and Arlington. The founding of El Paso Junior College in 1920 found Texas cities beginning to fund and support individual junior colleges. Senior colleges and universities also increased in number. The state established a school for women in 1920s at Denton, and normal schools were created in Canyon, Commerce, Kingsville, and Alpine. Normal schools were schools that taught students how to become public school teachers. And I might ask if anyone knows the origins of the term normal schools given to these teacher preparation institutions. The same legislature in 1923 that created these normal schools to prepare teachers for the public schools also created Texas Technological Institute in Lubbock to assist the people of that area of the state. Total student college enrollment in the 1920s increased 150%, forcing many institutions to turn to temporary buildings, which they euphemistically referred to as shacks. And these shacks became a symbol of the progress that was made in the 1920s, symbolic of the continuing progress that was needed. But what would occur to education in the 1930s in Texas, and to business in the 1930s in Texas, and to government in the 1930s Texas? There would ensue hard times, and hard times would force Texans to adopt hard solutions. The Depression would be felt in Texas by the early to mid 1930s, and Texas would lose the sense of progressive development, and there would be for a time regression because of the Great Depression of the 1930s. This brings our third testing period to a close. So we've covered these the third testing period in 5 tapes, and I hope that you will perhaps utilize these tapes and review them as you prepare for your test. And if you will forgive me for flipping through my notes, your third test is going to be on April the 8th, and we now have Beth Mater working with the class as a supplemental instructor, and so with these tapes and with Beth's assistance, I trust that you will improve your grade in Texas history 2303. For now, I want to sign off. I'll see you around campus, and I'll see you in the clouds as you prepare for your third test. See you later. Bye.